Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the week, and I hope you've had a thoroughly good lunch and have enjoyed all the wonderful talks that we've had. What I propose to do this afternoon is to talk about the proofs of reincarnation. Now, the word proof should be in inverted commas because it's actually almost impossible to prove these things, especially to people of a materialistic and skeptical viewpoint. But there are many indicators of the fact that we do have life after life in physical bodies. We all know that, and so in some senses I'm preaching to the converted, but in the wider world this is more difficult. Although more and more people in the West are now starting to believe in reincarnation. We've heard various people quote surveys which have been done in recent years showing that perhaps up to a third of people now in the West, in Europe and in America, believe in some kind of rebirth. And indeed, some surveys show, curiously, that more people believe in rebirth than actually believe in God, which is rather odd in some ways. I think that reincarnation is arguably one of the most profound spiritual truths that we really have to impart upon the world. Humanity needs to absorb this because it's central to our understanding of life itself, as well as the workings of the human soul. And accepting these truths has the power to transform humanity. When we change the way that we think of death, we also fundamentally change the way that we regard life itself. At one time, ideas of reincarnation were just the sole preserve of religion, but now it's broken out of that cage to some degree, and it's become a crucial question both for science and for philosophy as well. So it's something that everyone should consider, not just at the point before they die, but perhaps a little sooner than that. A century ago, reincarnation was virtually unknown in the West, apart from a few esoteric people. But now it really has got some traction, and people, I think, are fundamentally changing the way they view this. And there is a paradigm shift going on in the world, as we all know, at the moment. And more people describe themselves as spiritual rather than religious, which I think is huge, huge progress. The materialistic view of life is frankly ridiculous. The idea that we're here in physical bodies for one life only makes no sense whatsoever. And certainly the religions which have predominated in the West, the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, all reject it. Although, of course, Christianity embraced reincarnation as a fundamental principle until that notorious council, Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, when it was just cast out as one of the anathemas. The Christian explanation strikes me as being particularly absurd. The idea that we create a soul for one life only is illogical and makes no sense at all, because it would simply mean that souls are just warehoused in heaven for eternity for some unknown purpose. Now, many people object to reincarnation. I'll just briefly look at some of these objections. Perhaps I should begin by quoting that renowned esotericist of the 20th and 21st century, Woody Allen. He said that I didn't believe in reincarnation in my past life, and I still don't. The principal objection to reincarnation is, if it exists, why don't we remember past lives? Well, there are many reasons for this. Can you remember what you were doing 3 years ago last Tuesday? Can some of you even remember what you were doing last week? Possibly not. So if we were burdened, if we had knowledge of all our lives, all the many dozens or hundreds or even thousands of lives that we've had, it would be impossible for us to operate now. We'd be so consumed with those lives and all the horrible things that we've done in those lives that we would simply become so confused and so guilt-ridden that we would find it difficult to operate at all in this particular life. So the idea is that we have to engage in some kind of forgetfulness as we come into this life. And this is featured in a number of religions, from Chinese Buddhism to many other traditions as well. The Hebrew Kabbalists asserted that the night angel Lael enforces memory loss by pinching the nose and depressing the top lip of the lingering soul. This inability to recall is also enshrined in many ancient myths and legends, such as the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness in the Hades of Greek mythology. The Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus remarked, "Our body is the true river of Lethe, for souls plunged into it forget all. Our terrestrial body is like the Lethe." Meng Po, the goddess in charge of the underworld in Chinese Buddhism, forces souls to drink a special broth to obliterate all memories of previous lives before reincarnating again on Earth. Orlando was talking about rebooting the computer, and this is exactly what it is. In the Pistis Sophia, Jesus speaks of the soul drinking from a cup filled with the water of forgetfulness. So forgetfulness is vital. Without it, it would make each incarnation probably intolerable, remembering all the violent and nasty episodes that we've been through. So reincarnation and its accompanying cosmic law of karma is really the only logical spiritual explanation if we accept that we're immortal beings on an eternal evolutionary journey. And remember that reincarnation isn't a one-shot weapon. It's always a work in progress. So I'm going to do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the things which don't prove reincarnation, but suggest that the survival of the soul or some essence of ourselves is a reality. And science in recent years has gone into this much more deeply, certainly since the Second World War. I want to begin with perhaps the most powerful thing, which is not really scientific at all. It's our own inner deep conviction and knowledge, our own intuition that this is not the only life. This happened to me at a very early age, perhaps an indecently early age. I was standing in the playground when I was about 8 years old, and my friends were all saying, "Come on, Tim, let's play football." And I was just standing there, and I had this moment when I just realized that I'd been here before, not in that particular playground with those boys playing football, but on this earth in other lives. And I was brought up in a fairly traditional Christian household. And this was at complete odds and at complete variance with everything that I was told by my teachers, by the priest, and by my parents. But many people on the spiritual path develop this inner knowing and certainty that they have been here before, that they will be here again. And this intuition, as we know, is probably the principle which is emerging at the moment. We have 5 physical senses, and we're told that the wisdom intuition principle, the thing that theosophists call buddhi, is something that we're going to develop increasingly. I think people are increasingly developing this. But the problem is that we often tend to reject our intuitive feelings. We don't necessarily trust them because they bypass the logical mind and they also bypass our intellectual faculties. So this is information that runs on a much deeper channel, if you like, and it's not constrained by the limitations of the conscious mind. So those experiences at the age of 8 convinced me, and despite 50 years working in the dark arts of journalism, even that didn't undo my belief in these things. Now, one of the things which would suggest that we had this continuity of existence is in past life memories. Some of you here may well have had these particular thoughts. These past life memories can occur in all sorts of different ways. They can be spontaneous. People can just be walking down the street or having a conversation, and suddenly something breaks through into consciousness. They can also happen in dreams. Sometimes we get little fragments in dreams. Often we don't really understand these, but we get little insights and vignettes of things that happened to us in the past. But obviously these are often very, very difficult to separate. So one of the things that has happened quite a lot over the last 70 years is this process, which you'll be aware of, called hypnotic regression, where people are hypnotized and taken back into past lives. Indeed, I went through a series of sessions myself about 15 years ago. I went through 3 sessions and recalled, I think, about 8 or 10 lives. However, when I checked the most recent one and tried to ascertain whether this person had existed or not, and it was someone, a soldier who was killed in the Second World War, I actually found it impossible to prove or verify this. But during those hypnotic regression sessions, there was a definite truth emerging. However, I suspect that some of the details may have been conflated, some of them may have been coloured by other things, but nevertheless, despite the inaccuracy of detail, I think there was some definite veracity to all these things. Back in the 1970s, a hypnotherapist and psychologist called Dr. Helen Wambach, who died in 1986, only at the age of 40, she wrote about experiences that she'd had with her patients in a book called Life Before Life. And she carried out detailed analyses of thousands of regressed individuals. And she discovered that the soul doesn't enter the body until near the time of birth. Now, there are many versions of when the soul does enter, but this is what she particularly found in her work. She also identified that individuals exercise choice over the life that they're about to lead. She found that individuals with life before life experiences retained detailed past life memories, and these often displayed astonishing technical information and accurate descriptions about locations, clothing, food, architecture, and many other details. And she often found that these individuals who were regressed had better information even than the historical experts in that particular historical era. Her work demonstrated that reincarnation and heredity are complementary, but also independent, if that doesn't sound paradoxical. Her research showed that there appeared to be karmic hereditary links between individuals. This is something that's been alluded to this week, the idea that groups of people continually reincarnate together for various karmic necessities. In 1978, she carried out a particular research program involving 750 participants and guided them to the time immediately prior to birth. Now, one of the very interesting aspects of her work was that these subjects didn't concoct glamorous or ego-boosting past lives, where there were celebrity characters from history like William the Conqueror or Cleopatra. Most of them, the vast majority in fact, had led short, squalid and often very violent lives which weren't at all glamorous. In fact, they were monotonous, they were mundane, and often in very, very lowly positions. But to add weight to this idea of group incarnation, she found that 87% of those whom she'd regressed had been involved with family members, parents, lovers, and friends in all sorts of different relationships in past lives, and also, crucially, in the in-between states between lives. And interestingly, her subjects repeatedly provided evidence of group incarnation, reporting over and over again that we were coming to life accompanied by the same souls with whom we'd interacted in previous lives. Not only those whom we'd loved, but those also whom we'd feared and hated. In the same study, she found that 90% of those taking part regarded the after-death states as being pleasant. And 81% said, although they had chosen to be reborn, in many cases after consulting spiritual advisors on the inner planes, most were reluctant, with only 26% saying that they actually looked forward to reincarnating again on Earth, as if it were some kind of difficult or dreary task which had somehow to be performed. Also, to add weight to all this, these studies showed accurate ethnic, class, and population distribution. And although most of her subjects were white middle-class Americans, they tended to recall the fine details of other lives in other countries very accurately, in different races at different times. Between 60 and 75% of remembered lives were of the lowest social class, 20 to 30% were middle class, and a mere 5% were in the upper classes of whatever society they'd been in. And this is a fairly accurate, likely social distribution throughout history. She said that it's quite common for my subjects to tell me that after they've experienced death in a past life, a phobia or symptom they had has gone away. So remembering these past lives, she found, and many others have found, that they had a huge therapeutic value in this life. Now, a lot of this interest in past lives started in the early 1950s. Many of you will be aware of a case called the Bridey-Murphy case, yes? Well, back in 1952, a very good year, I was born that year, American housewife Ruth Simmons agreed to be hypnotized by psychologist Maury Bernstein just for a bit of fun, as part of an experiment. And she first regressed to childhood and remembered the toys that she'd played with at the age of 1. But in the next session, something more interesting happened. At the time, Ruth Simmons was 29, and she was from Colorado, and she was regressed to, quote, some other time. And she started to reveal very intricate details, and accurate details, in fact, of her past life as an Irish girl called Bridey Murphy from Cork in Ireland. And in 1806, she claimed to have been living with her mother Kathleen and her father Duncan, who was a barrister. At the age of 15, she'd attended school and later moved to Belfast after marrying a man called Brian McCarthy, and she died at the age of 66. She said that she'd lived for 40 years in the spirit world before being reborn into her current life in 1923. Now, when Bernstein checked out some of these claimed facts, he found that they were absolutely authentic, although Ruth Simmons didn't know anything about Ireland, she'd never been to the country. Could she have read about Bridey Murphy somewhere and maybe forgotten about it? Was it somewhere in her subconscious? Could she have heard stories maybe as a child which had left impressions in her deep unconscious? Or could it be a case of telepathy so that this information was transferred elsewhere? But this basically started great interest in this, and there were books and I think a Hollywood film about this as well, and this kind of acted as a catalyst for more research into past life experiences. But before her, back in the early part of the 20th century, you'll be aware of a man called Edgar Cayce. You've heard of him? Well, he's often called the sleeping prophet, and over the years he carried out thousands and thousands of what he called life readings. It started out with him actually diagnosing people's diseases and the causes of them. But what makes this interesting is that Edgar Cayce was a Presbyterian who didn't believe in reincarnation, and also he had absolutely no medical knowledge, but he managed to come out with very sophisticated diagnoses of his subjects. And what he did, he simply, when he was doing these readings, he lay down on a couch, went into some sort of trance, and then described these highly accurate personal histories covering many lives. And in some cases, he never even met the people. They'd just written to him, and he was still able to give readings. The fact that he was an unbeliever in reincarnation and the fact that he had no medical knowledge didn't prove to be any impediment at all. So it appears that Cayce had access to some deeper level of knowledge, possibly the Akashic records we talk about, the indelible memory of all human activity which is permanently etched on the astral plane, as well as the unconscious minds of individuals who were concerned in those readings. And with this approach, he was able to describe people's detailed personal histories, often covering many, many incarnations. Now, intriguingly, the Cayce readings also pointed to the existence of recurrent soul groupings, something which emerges again and again and again when this research is carried out. And Cayce unearthed various what he called karmic patterns, which linked current disabilities to previous misdeeds, or in some cases not just misdeeds, but lack of action. And his diagnoses were often blunt to the point of being savage. He told one of his deaf subjects, "Then don't close your ears to those who plead to you for aid." So we see that karma is not just about action, it can also be about inaction too. And he did a lot of readings for children with various different ailments. And he claimed that, for example, the savage barbarities inflicted by the conquistadors on the Aztecs in the 16th century resulted in many of those invaders being reincarnated again during the Spanish Civil War and all the barbarities that involved. He also had some very interesting things to say about Atlantis. In fact, half of all Cayce's life readings tracked individuals' rebirths back to Atlantis. Those engaged in its destruction, he claimed, were now on Earth in large numbers. And he said, given that reincarnation is a fact, and that souls once occupied such an environment as Atlantis, and that these are now entering the Earth's sphere, if they made such alternations in the Earth's affairs in their day as to bring destruction on themselves, can there be any wonder that they might make such changes in the affairs of peoples and individuals today? And this was written 70 or 80 years ago. Yesterday we heard the very eloquent remarks by Dr. Tucker about physical wounds and marks that are found on children. And I think this is a very rich source of evidence for past lives. Wounds and scars, marks, pains in this particular life appear, as he said, to reflect the injuries inflicted in past lives, or even, in some cases, the cause of death itself. So someone who's hanged for stealing a sheep may have wounds on the neck. But this also can be extended to things like fears and phobias and illnesses. As we know, many people have very strong likes and dislikes, and they can't trace where these actually came from. People have fears and phobias about spiders, enclosed spaces, heights, or even yellow curtains. And these often appear to be highly irrational because they can't be linked to any apparent trauma in the individual's current life. So could these fears and phobias be somehow the emotional residue of convulsive events that we've experienced in past lives? Geoffrey Hodgson, whom many of you will know as a very prominent theosophist during the 20th century, he had quite a lot to say about this, and he thought that disease was often the result of people's cruelty in past lives, as if it was some kind of compensatory activity. Hodgson himself was a former soldier. He was a tank commander in the First World War, and he believed that things like fears of explosions, shots, planes flying overhead, or weapons could almost certainly be related back to the result of what had happened in war, especially amongst those people who were killed in wars who reincarnated quickly afterwards. But he also attributed things like claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, to death in a past life from imprisonment, while agoraphobia, fear of open spaces, to death from thirst or hunger or being lost and injured in open spaces. He believed that irrational terror of birds, beasts of prey, bats, spiders, snakes, and other creatures was the result of death from these creatures somewhere in the past. Similarly, fear of water, earth, fire, caves, or heights could also be related to the mode of death in a previous life. Perhaps like me, if you're fairly sensitive, you go to a place for the first time and you feel very attracted to that place. You feel a resonance with it. At the same time, you might feel an absolute fear and repulsion about this place. And I think this is also strong evidence, persuasive evidence, that something has been left, some memory has been left from a previous life. People often experience a feeling of what we call déjà vu when they've been to a place. And in some cases, we find people who are visiting a strange city for the first time experience an instant sense of recognition. And often, curiously, they are able to describe the layout of that city in great detail and even negotiate its streets, even though they've never been there before. And sometimes they're able to provide highly specific or complex details about a particular locality. And in some cases, there's direct recall of their having actually been there in another body at another time. Of course, this doesn't, like all the other things, doesn't provide any solid proof that science would recognize, but it does furnish additional evidence, in my view, that the memory of a place sometimes leaves a permanent imprint on our minds, especially if something very powerful has happened in this place, something powerful, good or bad. So it would seem that these memories, once they're stored there, can be triggered off by certain events in this life. The notion of reincarnation, I think, also explains the huge discrepancies and differences that we see in individuals. It explains the vast differences in people's physical, emotional, mental, psychological, moral, and spiritual qualities as well. So it would seem that the emergence of saints or sinners isn't a random event. It also Reincarnation also explains some of the strange quirks of heredity and why children born into the same family can often display such staggeringly different characteristics and aptitudes from one another. One brother becomes a priest, the other gets locked up for larceny. It also accounts as well for the hugely different circumstances in people's lives and why some are born in palaces and other people remain rooted in the slums and the ghettos. This, of course, we all know is a result of working out karma. Why is it that some people get so much out of life when they put so little into it, and other people work so hard and are always struggling to make ends meet or to have a decent life? And why is it that the people who work hardest are often left with nothing? It seems extremely unfair until you bring in this notion of karma. So it's these twin interlocking forces, because remember, reincarnation and karma are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And so these weave their overall long-term inextricable justice on life, because we know that the law of karma is a fair one. Another thing which I think furnishes us with some evidence is when we get childhood prodigies, young children who display extraordinary abilities. And throughout recorded history, there have been a great many individuals who've shown remarkable talents or genius from a very early age. And this is often put forward as evidence that these individuals may have acquired such skills in a previous life or lives, and effectively then they were serving an apprenticeship of some kind, which would then come to fruition at some future life. And what's interesting about this is that child prodigies tend not to, in most cases, recall previous lives. Perhaps the most often quoted example of this is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756 to 1791. And he showed precocious talents during his very early years. He was composing minuets, a sonata, and a piano concerto at the age of 4, and a full-length opera at the age of 7. So how else could he have acquired these skills? Did he just come into this life and was suddenly able to do these things? I don't think so. There are many other examples of this as well. In fact, the Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero asserted that the rate at which children absorb knowledge suggested that individuals knew things before birth. And Plato put it even more plainly in his theory of reminiscence. He said that knowledge easily acquired is that which the enduring self had in an earlier life, so that it flows back easily. In fact, the very word education itself means to draw from that which is already known. And I think that's significant in itself. Perhaps one of the most remarkable cases was that of Christian Friedrich Heineken, nothing to do with beer makers. He was known as the Infant of Lübeck, and he was born in 1721 in Germany. Now, if the accounts are to be believed, he was speaking within a few hours of birth, and by the age of 1 was well versed in the first 5 books of the Bible. By the age of 2, he'd absorbed all the biblical history in its entirety, and by the age of 3, all the broad outlines of world history as known at that time, along with Latin, French, as well as German. He even predicted his own death, and he died at the age of 4. There are other individuals with outstanding talents, and there are, of course, autistic savants that we come across. A very famous one was a man called Blind Tom Wiggins, who was born in 1849 in America. And he stunned people at the time with his remarkable piano playing abilities, at the age of 4, and he was one of these people who was able to pick up a song instantly. And he became a bit of a celebrity in the United States and performed very widely. Now, we're going to come on to another phenomenon which is actually very rare, xenoglossy. Xeno, strange, glossy from the Greek word for words. It's a rare phenomenon in which people suddenly, spontaneously start speaking a language of which they have absolutely no knowledge. The term was actually first coined by Dr. Charles Richet in 1905. And there are a number of very well documented cases of individuals suddenly speaking fluently in tongues that they had no knowledge of. In one particular case, the researcher Dr. Ian Stevenson and Dr. Satwant Pasrika highlighted the case of a woman called Uttara Hudar. Now, she was a 32-year-old single woman from central India, and 6 years earlier, she'd suddenly started speaking in some obscure 19th century Bengali dialect. And it seemed on research that she'd assumed the personality of this shy married housewife from West Bengal called Shadara. And these appearances, these instances of her speaking, appeared regularly, and sometimes they lasted for days or even weeks. But Shadara afterwards couldn't remember a thing about them. Now, Uttara was an outgoing woman, a sophisticated woman with a master's degree in English, while Shadara had been a poorly educated woman and deeply at ease with the modern world. When they researched this, they found that indeed there were records from 1827 corresponding to family names which Shadara had given. And it also emerged that Shadara's memories extended to the age when she was just 22 and had been bitten on her toe by a snake. And as a child, Uttara, the modern version, had had this absolute phobia about snakes. Another of the people who've researched this, Dr. Maurice Netherton, began to be convinced about reincarnation as he himself was actually having regression therapy to deal with a chronic bleeding ulcer. And he recalled a life held back in 1818, and he linked the ulcer that he had to being kicked viciously in the stomach by prison guards. But interestingly, after this session, the pain went and it never returned. And he actually then went on to regress many other patients, including an 11-year-old boy from California who'd suddenly started to speak in an obscure Chinese dialect. And on research, it was found that this particular language was part of a text from a forbidden religion of ancient China. How could he have picked this up? So Dr. Netherton went on to have more than 1,200 hours of past life examination, and he also regressed hundreds of his own patients. And it didn't matter whether people believed in reincarnation or not, these memories still came through. And he concluded that each individual returns to Earth at the exact same stage of development as they reached at their times of death. And this is something that ties in very much with theosophy. One of the areas which has been researched very thoroughly are near-death experiences, which have become much more common and widely studied. They've become much more common because medical science is now able to bring people back from severe illness or injury and use techniques which weren't available before. One researcher, Dr. Pim van Lommel, carried out a 10-year study of 344 cardiac arrest survivors, and he found that between 12 and 14% of those had experienced NDEs, or near-death experiences. They found that in the United States alone, many millions, up to 13 million people, had had near-death experiences. And we often hear cases where people have operations where they're completely unconscious, and yet they're aware of what's going on in the operating theatre, and they describe later conversations between the surgeon and the nurse, or someone dropping a scalpel on the floor, and that sort of thing. And there also, we'll come into this in just a moment, out-of-the-body experiences which are not the same, but which share some of the same hallmarks. I'll give you an example of one person, a filmmaker called Victor Solo, who suffered a cardiac arrest, and he was dead for 23 minutes. Now, Solo was a skeptic and a religious and spiritual skeptic, but he wrote very eloquently about his experiences. And this is what he wrote. He said, "For me, the transition from life to death was easy. There was no time for pain, fear, or thought. I was moving at high speed toward a net of great luminosity. The strands and knots where the luminous lines intersected were vibrating with a tremendous cold energy. The grid appeared as a barrier that would prevent further travel." More recently, there is the case of a man called Dr. Eben Alexander. This is a very interesting case because you'll have heard of this, many of you. He was a prominent US neurosurgeon, so he's got very great credentials, but also he was another spiritual skeptic, and he didn't have any belief in this at all. But back in 2008, he contracted a rare form of bacterial meningitis, and he went into a deep coma. And it was shown that he had huge brain damage. Previously, he considered himself purely a man of science with no spiritual perspective whatever. But suddenly he went into this strange journey which lasted for 7 days. And he found himself going through various worlds and situations, the first of which he called the realm of the earthworm's view. And here he found himself in something that seems to have been the equivalent of the astral world, where there were monsters and reptilian, worm-like creatures. And then he emerged from this into a much more beautiful world of filaments of radiating white gold light. And he heard beautiful music. Beautiful music often accompanies these kinds of experiences. And then he becomes aware of other entities, in particular a girl who accompanies him on this journey. And this girl tells him all sorts of different things about himself. But she gave him a threefold message. She says, "You're loved and cherished. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing that you can do wrongly." And then the scene shifts again, and Dr. Alexander is in an area that he calls the gateway. And here he realizes that all the senses are very different. Seeing and hearing become the same thing. And eventually he gets to the heart of all this, a place that he calls the core. And here he comes into contact with other entities, angelic entities, perhaps what we would call devas. And he gets all sorts of information from this higher dimensional worlds, and knowledge came instantly and effortlessly to him. But eventually this journey comes to an end, and he hears this young boy pleading for his return. This turns out to be his son. And he then begins to recover from his 7-day coma. Now, we've had these near-death experiences. One of the researchers, Dr. Raymond Moody, again someone you'll have heard of, he was a vigorous researcher into near-death experiences and similar states. But he also identified something which was even more interesting, which he calls the shared death experience. This features many of the same ingredients as near-death experiences. He discovered that in some cases, two people have a joint review of a loved one's life. For example, a woman called Susan, who was watching her son die from cancer, was suddenly swept up into a cloud at the moment of his death and witnessed scenes from his life, some of them unfamiliar to her, which he'd not told her about in the past. There was a man called Mr. Sykes from North Carolina who was dying from Alzheimer's disease. Suddenly, as he's approaching death, he wakes up and becomes very lucid and coherent and begins carrying on a conversation with his brother Hugh, who was in Massachusetts at the time. And at exactly the same time, Hugh dies of a heart attack. Now, a lot of these experiences have very similar hallmarks. There was a case of a woman called Jane who suddenly experiences a change in energy as her husband is dying from cancer. The room becomes brighter, it fills with a white light and swirling particles. And she finds herself floating above her dying husband's bed, and she can see herself sitting at the bedside below. And together they share a life review in panoramic form. And she also witnesses scenes from his life of which she was unaware, for example, his military training. Another of these examples that Dr. Moody found was of two twin brothers, identical twins, who share a close rapport. One weekend, one of the brothers goes out of town to watch a football game, the other stays at home. The one at home has an out-of-the-body experience and sees this bright light. And he vividly remembers childhood and other events with his brother. And he feels very disturbed about this. An hour later, a policeman knocks on the door to tell him that his brother has just been killed in a car accident. Now, interestingly, none of Dr. Moody's subjects experienced the stereotypical cartoon-style heaven of pearly gates and angels and all that sort of stuff. Nor did they experience any kind of hell-like visions of devils and fire and brimstone or anything like that. Now, these out-of-the-body experiences, which have certain similarities to shared death experiences and near-death experiences, have some of the same ingredients, which I'll briefly go through just as we draw to a conclusion with this. There's often a change of geometry in the room, and exits appear. Sometimes, often, the experience is accompanied by music or musical sounds. There's this feeling of overwhelming peace and well-being. Individuals experience a separation from the physical body and find themselves looking down on themselves from above, often in a hospital setting. The dying person often, nearly always, experiences some kind of life review. They then enter a dark void, a tunnel, a passage, and they emerge into bright light at the other end. And there they encounter often heavenly or otherworldly realms and beautiful natural settings. This happens in more than half of these NDE cases. And then they encounter meetings with people. It can be family, friends, religious figures such as Jesus or other beings. And then they're taken on a journey. But interestingly, they can only go so far in this journey, and then they're met with a barrier, water, a lake, a wall, and they're told that you have to go back. It's not your time to be here. Of course, both men and women have these near-death experiences, but as one might expect, men are a bit more reluctant to talk about them than women. And the most common response to those who've experienced NDEs are, "I now know that we live forever. I'm no longer afraid of death because it's just another plane of existence." We'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.